My name is Percy Phillips. I'm here representing Prairie Quinoa, and I'm here at the quinoa variety trials in Carberry, Manitoba this morning. The first question is about quinoa and the suitability of growing quinoa in Manitoba. I think that was proven by Agriculture Canada in the 1980s. The Agriculture Canada had a project in Morden and with some field trials in Boissevain to trial quinoa in Manitoba. That's a long time ago. This was a fully funded Agriculture Canada project at the end of 5 years. And after showing that they could grow quinoa quite nicely in Manitoba, in their wisdom, Agriculture Canada decided not to continue the project. So this is something I was unaware when I started my project with quinoa, but quinoa can grow in Manitoba quite nicely. It was grown in the 1980s for several years. They proved that they could do so, and so the suitability for Manitoba, I think, has been proven for some time. Some of the agronomic circumstances we need to have to grow quinoa. Quinoa needs a lighter soil that's well drained. So quinoa will not do well in heavier soils, which have got a lot of clay in it that are quite dense. It needs to be well drained soil. It doesn't necessarily have to have a slope on it, it just needs to be well drained. If water sits around the quinoa roots for even a period of time, it will not do well. For some reason it recognizes it's not home. So we have found that an area between starting about Portage la Prairie and coming here to Carberry and then going farther west, almost to the Saskatchewan border, is the ideal part of Manitoba. And then if you follow that soil type north all the way up to Swan River and down to the American border, quinoa has been grown successfully in that area of Manitoba. It's the soil profile and a little bit on the lighter side. From an agronomic point of view, quinoa is planted in much the same conditions and depth and rate as canola. So any equipment used to plant canola that's relatively shallow. So the number one challenge is the shallow planting and lighter soil to get good germination and to get a good stand going quickly. That's the number one challenge to growing quinoa. And then we have the three things which affect every crop, which are weeds, disease, and pests. Weeds, it just helps, as with every other crop, it helps to have a good, clean field to start with. And we are talking about conventional, not organic quinoa, but if the cleaner field, the better to start with. Quinoa is a broadleaf, so controlling broadleaves is difficult. Controlling grassy weeds is not a big problem. We're having the start of some of the items, some of the applications which can be used. There's some conditional use stuff, and those are there. So weeds are one thing. Disease is a different one. Quinoa is typically grown in arid parts of the world. So when we get long, prolonged periods of moisture, the moisture will, and the Achilles heel of quinoa is downy mildew. So if we've got downy mildew, will affect some varieties, and I've been working to try to find varieties that work in our part of the world that are not susceptible to downy mildew as they might be if they come from an arid part of the world and grow here. In terms of disease, pests are a significant issue. For instance, lygus bugs, I've yet to grow any quinoa ever without the presence of lygus present. So if you grow quinoa next to a hay field, when you take your first cut of hay, the lygus is going to find someplace else to reside. So it simply goes, it needs lunch someplace else. It will simply move over, infest your quinoa, and have a significant effect. You'll see it on the panicles with some little dead spots like this. There's also a stem borer that's visible down at the bottom of plants before they get to this stage, which can be So we've got three or four pests in Manitoba that can really damage a quinoa crop, and they need to be dealt with either in one other method or another. But learning how to recognize those and do preventative, and that's without grasshoppers. Now we have had grasshoppers this year, but they seem to prefer some of the other domestic crops before they get to quinoa. It's like quinoa is their last result, but they are happy to do damage on some of the other crops earlier. So, weeds, disease, and pests, we've learned how to control all of them to get to a point we're at a commercial yield of quinoa that makes sense. One of the other things that's important to note is we've found that quinoa can be quite frost resistant. So much so that frost can take place and kill wild mustard and canola, volunteer canola that's in the field. And it'll kill that. The quinoa will survive. And we've got documented cases here in Manitoba where quinoa will survive -3 degrees C. A lot of the other plants would be damaged. Quinoa will fine. So we keep, the people I've worked with, we keep instructing them to plant it as early as possible. That gives a couple of things. It gives it a chance to get start. We have a good chance of soil moisture in the springtime, etc. It gives the plants to grow, and away we go. One of the other questions that I was asked was the economic future, so I'll make one more comment about agronomic. If you can seed it with canola equipment, manage it, get it to the point where you can harvest it properly. We've learned how to harvest it with conventional combines. A good grain combine, like a Claas or even some of the old Gleaner combines, have proven to be very effective in harvesting quinoa with a 30-foot header, direct cut, or we've done it also swathing. It just doesn't work very well to get the quinoa very wet once it's swathed, but if you need to swath it, you need to get it up off the ground pretty briskly, and go from there. In terms of the economics, or the future for quinoa production, I listened to a seminar recently by a gentleman who's in charge of quinoa importing and sales by Ardent Mills in the US. One of his points is, and he is the average American, or if the American population divided by the quinoa consumption and grown quinoa in the United States works out to about 8 ounces of quinoa per American per year. That's maybe, statistics are a year or two old, but that's it. So quinoa as flour or constituents in pasta and cooked on its own, it's 8 ounces. And to put that into perspective, the average American eats approximately 20 to 22 pounds of rice a year. So his point, and it was an important one, if quinoa goes from 8 ounces per American per year to 16 ounces, or 1 pound per American per year, it is not possible for South America to produce that volume of quinoa for the American market. The land mass and the productivity and the varieties and everything else, they will have to get that quinoa from someplace else, and that will come from commercial farms here in Canada, the United States, and possibly from Europe, where they're learning how to grow quinoa. There are some places in Europe, in France and Spain, where they've been quite effective in growing quinoa. So I expect, and the reason that I'm so interested and passionate in it, that quinoa production will continue to grow in the prairies. The issue for us is not the interest in quinoa, it's how to do it commercially, and how to do it commercially and market it commercially. Well, we're here in Carberry at the viewing the Manitoba Agriculture Variety Trials of Quinoa in 2021. And what we have is 3 rows. We have guards on both sides, and then we have 7 different varieties of quinoa that are grown at the same time, same seeding date and all the rest. The varieties will have We've tried to do our best to get them all in the ground at the same germination, at the same population of seeding, to compare the yield and whatnot to them. You can see the physical differences on the quinoa, some of them height-wise, some of them appearance, and we've got one particular variety that's very yellowish or orange in color that's getting close to maturity. One of the issues about quinoa is that quinoa is sensitive to heat only when its pollen tubes are forming. So the pollen tubes are forming if it is above 35 degrees C for an extended period of time. Quinoa will simply not produce mature seed. So there's an issue about when timing takes place and the variety to avoid that, which we've learned how to do. So if we come along and we just take a sample of some of this and rub it in our hands, we can see that we've got seed forming. Some varieties are forming seed better than others, but in this year, which has been a difficult year for agriculture in Manitoba, as long as quinoa gets off good and early and gets a good start, it can handle what are considered dry conditions in Manitoba quite well, because the dry conditions here are normal, or maybe a little on the wet side compared to the places where quinoa originally came from South America. So it's the issue here is a good start, good seed. I've worked to find varieties of seed that'll work well in our 100 to 110 day growing season, and this is actually an excellent demonstration of the guard varieties, and then how the others compare in terms of what the panicles look like. And it'll just be very interesting to find out what the yield is like at the end of it. But this is an excellent demonstration of what quinoa should look like in a difficult year here in Carberry.